All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Portals to the Past. I'm your host, Will Hickoks of the Watkins Museum of History. Portals to the Past is a series of interviews with historical figures and people who are historians talking about the history of the Kansas-Missouri border region. This series is a partnership between Humanities Kansas, Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, and the Watkins Museum of History. So today we are departing from our usual format of reenactor portrayals, and we're talking with Old West and firearms historian Stuart Barber about a legendary individual of the 19th century frontier, James Butler Wild Bill Hickok. So who was the real man that inspired the myths that we're all familiar with? And was the West really as wild as popular culture claims? Stuart will discuss Hickok's real life as a scout and lawman and dig into some of these ideas that we have about what the man who was actually Wild Bill. So we encourage you, the audience members, to get involved by posting questions for our guest in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please use only the Q&A feature and not the chat feature. That helps us curate the questions and keep them all in one spot and makes it easier to see what questions have been posted. And I'll also let you know that those who are unable to attend this live event will be able to view the video on the Watkins Museum of History YouTube channel next week. We are also streaming live on the Watkins Facebook page. So with that, I would like to start off the interview. So first of all, I want to say welcome, Stuart Barber.
Well, good morning.
Good morning to you. Okay, so let's dive in. So first, I wonder if you could tell us a little about your own background, Stuart, and how you became interested in Hickok and some of the venues where you've discussed him and other aspects of Old West history. And also, I believe that, like me, you are distantly related to Wild Bill himself.
That's correct. So we have something in common there as well. I'm related through marriage on my mother's side. My great aunt, or she would be a great aunt Bessie, married into the Hickok family. And what really set me on the trail of Wild Bill was many years ago, I read Joseph G. Rose's book, Gunfighter Man or Myth. And when looking through that, there were only a handful of these people that really stood head and shoulders above all the rest when all the myth was stripped away. And James Butler Wild Bill was the one who was a real person.
That's interesting. So you are not portraying Hickok for us today, but I believe you do have a historical persona. And I'm wondering if you could fill us in on that and this activity of cowboy action shooting.
I've been involved in cowboy action shooting for a little over 20 years. And in cowboy action shooting, of course, it is a shooting sport that uses firearms of basically pre-1899, from 1850 to 1899. As well as the competition, you also develop a character or persona and you costume to it. Well, I was very fortunate that when I signed up that Hickok's brother's moniker was available, Tame Bill. So what you're seeing, I shoot.
That's very interesting, Tame Bill. Well, let's get into the real story behind Hickok. So where and how did James Butler Hickok grow up, and why did he go west, and did he have an affinity for firearms in his youth?
Okay, we'll try to take those one at a time. Hickok was the first of the children that was born in Illinois. The family migrated from upstate Vermont, North Hero in that area, to LaSalle. It was in those days it was called Homer. I think nowadays it's Troy Grove, Illinois. Mendota, Illinois would be the city you could probably actually see on the map that he would be closest to. He, at an early age, lost his father, and it was a large family. He had two older brothers and had two younger sisters, if I remember correctly, Celinda and Lydia. Instead of tying himself behind the plow to support the family, he had an old flintlock that he was very fond of and very good with. So he started then providing for the family by shooting wild game. So yes, he had an affinity for firearms that carried on through the rest of his life. You could say that he was an enthusiast as well as used them in his military and his law enforcement activities.
Okay, well, you provided us with a perfect segue there in mentioning his military and law enforcement activities. So let's dive into the origins of the nickname Wild Bill. How did Hickok acquire this moniker, and did he really justify having this nickname?
There are several schools of thought on how he was given the moniker Wild Bill. Now, remember, at that period of time, there were probably pretty close to 23 to 24 people called Wild Bill. William Cress, Wild Blue, Wild Bill of the Blue, and I mean, there was a bunch of them. I think the most reliable information that the research over the years working with Joe Rosa has turned up, that at some time during the Civil War, because a lot of his narrow escapes when he was spying for the Union behind enemy lines in Arkansas, he had gained that name. I think Buffalo Bill alludes to it one time in an escape where he charges away from the Confederate lines and swims his horse across the river with just bullets whizzing around his head, and a cheer goes up from the other side, good for you, Wild Bill, which of course is purely fiction. How could they tell? But at some time in the Missouri and Arkansas, in that area, he had acquired the nickname Wild Bill. He did use, when he was spying, the name Billy Barnes. That was someone that he had met that was from Texas, and it was a pretty good cover story when he was infiltrating the lines down there. Another story is that he earned it in Independence, Missouri, when he was visiting with his brother Lorenzo. An angry mob was trying to lynch a bartender, and Wild Bill jumped up in front of them, or James jumped up in front of them, pulled both of his revolvers, and basically drove the crowd away. And then someone from the crowd again calls, "Attaboy, Wild Bill." That's probably fiction as well. Most likely, the origin of the name was sometime during the Civil War when he was a scout and also a spy for the Union.
That's fascinating. And I had no idea that there were so many Wild Bills in the West.
Oh, yeah. There was Mortimer Cress. Wild Bill of the Blue was one that some of his deeds have been blamed on, James Butler Hickok.
Oh.
But, Wild Bill never did kill the 3 Indians that they accuse him of doing. And that turned out to be, Wild Bill of the Blue.
Yet another myth.
Mm-hmm.
So describe for us a little bit more about Wild Bill's career as a law enforcement officer. And in your opinion, was he effective in this role?
Okay. Now remember, this is the frontier. This is not even part of the United States at the time. There were territories. Law enforcement was typically the particular town or village or township, or even the county would find someone who was of pretty strong character and would stand up to the lawless element, because the frontier draws that. Typically, the lawless are driven out of the more civilized parts of the country, and they flock to the frontier where they can then, commit their crimes. Wild Bill was of such an early time in law enforcement that he was of that 2-gun town taming marshal. He had deputies in like Abilene toward the end of his career in law enforcement, but the majority of the dangerous work he always felt he needed to take on himself. Hays, Kansas, without doubt, was the most dangerous township or city at the time, and probably where he had his most deadly conflicts. There was a matter of 3 gunfights in Hays, one of them coming as early as the 3rd or 4th day that he was in office, where he was bushwhacked by a gentleman by the name of Mulvey, and Hickok calmly looked over his shoulder as if he were speaking to someone behind Mulvey and said, "Boys, don't shoot a man. He's just drunk." Well, Mulvey turned to look, and of course Hickok shot him at that point in time. So that kind of set the tone for what was going to happen in Hays. The people in Ellis County trusted him so much that he was the sheriff for the county, Ellis County. He was city marshal for Hays City, and he was a deputy U.S. Marshal for Kansas under, I believe it was Whiting at the time, was the marshal itself for the area. So he had a number of jobs, and also at that time, I believe, owned part of a saloon in Hays. But when you read the reports and some of the memoirs of the people who lived there during that time, very few of them think negatively of Wild Bill, and many of them thank him for actually being able to put a lid on the violence that was going on in Hays and had been going on.
Excellent.
So
Yeah.
be that as it may, in that environment, he was a very effective person at keeping law and order. Was he a schooled and trained lawman? No.
Interesting. So here's an interesting question from Diana, and this sort of perhaps gets back to Hickok's earlier history. She says, I've read many of Wild Bill's letters, which are available through the Kansas Historical Society website, which is a great website. I will just add as an aside for those who are interested. He was obviously literate, but I'm curious what access he might have had to formal education.
Let's back up. When he was a young man, his father was well educated. He was a college trained. Matter of fact, he was going to be going into the clergy, if I remember correctly. And both Hickok's mother, Polly, as well as his father, William Alonzo, put a great deal of emphasis on homeschooling. All the children had to be able to read, to write, and do ciphers, mathematics. And so there was a lot of education in the home. As far as formal education, remember at that time in Illinois, that was still the edge of the frontier. It hadn't been that long since, I think it was the Black Hawk Indian Wars had been going on. So the area had just, in recent history, when they moved there and he was born, been pacified. So yes, he was literate. Remember, a lot of those letters in those days were written phonetically. So where people will see certain words that are spelled out phonetically, they think, well, the person must have been stupid. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was one for spelling things phonetically on occasion as well, and he was a very well-educated, intelligent person. So was Hickok a master's degree in anything? No, but he would have had in those days what would have been equivalent of probably a basic college education.
That's interesting. So how about we dive into some material culture now, some material culture history. So was Hickok, as a lawman, as a scout, as the celebrity figure, well known for carrying any particular firearms? And I know that many of us have probably seen some famous photos of Hickok, but I wonder if in some cases were those just props, and was he famous for using any particular guns?
Wild Bill is almost solely identified with Colt's 1851 Navy belt revolver, this right here. Now, he was a firearms enthusiast, and he owned, I won't say a lot, but he owned a number of firearms through his career. And the 51 Navy was, at that time, the first gun that was light enough that it could be carried on the belt, didn't have to be carried on the horse, yet had an efficient enough power that it was a man stopper. The later 1860 Army and some of the others were designed to be able to stop the horse as well as the man. But the 51 was a 6-shot revolver. It was very reliable, very quick handling. And you'll see some stories where Senator Henry Wilson had presented him with a pair of engraved navies for taking his family on a hunt. That's never been verified. Hickok purchased the guns. There are 3 identified guns that have a high degree of provenance that they were Hickok's. All 51 Navies. One is owned by the Autry Museum, and it's the most engraved and has the eagles on the grip. That one is probably in the range of 60% probability of being Wild Bill's. The pair that were at the Cody Museum in Wyoming, one is owned by the museum, another one was owned by a doctor's family, part of his estate. those two are probably as close to 100% provenance. Those were guns that he had with them when he was murdered in Deadwood. And according to several books, they were raffled off afterward by Colorado Charlie Utter to pay for the funeral. He also had a pair of 1851 Navies that were cartridge conversions. Colt wasn't able to do a bored through cylinder because of the Rollins White patent until about 1871. So they had developed a technique of converting them to use both rimfire and centerfire cartridges. And in White-Eye Anderson's book, I Buried Hickok, he recalls he was on the wagon train with Colorado Charlie and with Hickok. Hickok had a brand new pair of 51 Navy conversions and had bought a case of ammo. And he would practice every morning before they got to Deadwood by taking White-Eye's hat, throwing it in the air, and then shooting it with both guns. And then would tell him that count the holes. If one's missing, then I'll give up. And of course, the first thing he did when he got to Deadwood is he bought the young man a new hat. But so the 51 Navy, without doubt, sometimes is almost as famous as Wild Bill. But he was known to own Remingtons. He was given a pair of Smith & Wesson #3 Americans by Cody and Texas Jack Omohundra. But his fighting gun of choice was always the 51 Navy and 36 caliber.
All right. Well, we have a very apt question here from Mary, who works for I believe recently retired from the Kansas Museum of History and is actually one of my former professors. And she mentions that the Kansas Museum of History has a Belgian-made Beaumont Adams model 1855-56. We received it in 1934 from the widow of Frank J. Willstash, who wrote a book about Wild Bill Hickok and was a gun collector. The only provenance we have is that she said the gun belonged to Hickok when she donated it. Do you think this story could be true?
If we're to base our decision on his book, heck no. It's hard to say. So much about Wild Bill has been fictionalized or sensationalized. I mean, even going back to the first national article that they wrote on him in Harper's Weekly, that it's hard to take a lot of them seriously. Even when you look to the more contemporary authors like Connolly, in a lot of cases, just restated fiction that he had read from Willstash, and even going back to Buell, which was the earliest, 1879, if I remember correctly, when that book was published. I don't know that there is strong provenance to link Hickok to that revolver, just like Dickinson County has a Remington that they claim was Wild Bill's. I think it was either a 63 or a 58, but the provenance there is pretty thin. There's a Smith & Wesson #2 that's been floating around that has no provenance. And then the Adams Museum bought a 1860 Richards conversion that when Mr. Pollock was shopping that around, we could only trace it to Colorado Charlie Utter. But I am not going to disparage the folks in Deadwood.
Well, not to get too pretentious, but it almost sounds like Hickok's guns connected with him are like pieces of the True Cross, where they end up everywhere, and there's very little provenance in some cases. That's very interesting. So let's talk a little bit more about some material culture, because we have some questions, and I know that I have a question. And actually, maybe I'll use my question as a jumping off point. So we're all familiar with the classic Western films that always depict the cowboys and the lawmen and the outlaws with their guns slung low on their hips. And I always wondered if that was actually a practical way of carrying a firearm, especially back then. And we also have a related question from, let's see if I can find it again, from, well, I'm having trouble finding it, but someone else, I believe, asked, oh, here we go, from another question from Diana. Can you explain how Hickok and a lot of other plainsmen drew guns from their holsters or sashes? So I guess you have two questions there. How did they actually carry their guns, and how would they draw them?
Well, let's address the first part, your question, and then we'll address the second part. The low slung holsters that we saw, starting with the old 2 or 3 reelers back in the silent era, all the way up through the odors that John Wayne was doing, were called Buscadero rigs. They were a large belt. They had a slot cut in the belt. The holster fit into that slot. Those didn't show up on the frontier probably till the mid to late 1880s. A lot of the holsters in those days were military holsters where they had simply cut the flap off them. They were using saber belts in many cases with a pouch that contained either the loose round balls, or in foils, or what they called skins, which was a pre-made black powder cartridge just made with a nitrated paper. So it would, remember, these guns were not cartridge guns. They loaded from the front of the cylinder with loose powder, a round ball, and the percussion cap was placed on the cone or the nipple to the back of it. And that's how they created a cartridge within that chamber. So the majority of the people at that time carried the guns high, because think about this. What was the conveyance of the era? A horse. And sitting on a horse, down holsters. So if you look at Hickok, Hickok was a purveyor of the plains or twist draw. He wore a saber type belt with a Union officer's buckle at the waist, had 2, I believe they were Winchester and Maine holsters, or what they would call a Slim Jim holster. And he wore the guns with the butts forward. Now, in this era, remember, black powder is not the most efficient propellant, but it's what you got. And they had long barrels so they could take advantage of the slower burning rate of black powder to gain more velocity. So in order to draw a longer revolver, many of them preferred to have the guns with the butts forward, or what they call a twist draw. And the way you draw that gun can be done 2 ways. The most common with Hickok was he would draw the right hand gun with the right hand, the left hand gun with the left hand, by bringing and turning his palms to the outside, grasping the gun, putting his thumb over the hammer, and if he lifted the gun straight up and then snapped it forward, the snapping or the straightening up of the wrist would cock the hammers, because your guns in that era, the 51 Colts, the 60 Armies, had very tall hammer spurs. So you would draw straight up, snap your wrist forward, and as the wrist came forward, the guns were leveled and cocked. Now, later on, again, as cartridge guns developed, you saw belts with cartridge loops. You saw people carrying 1 gun instead of 2, 3, 4. I think it was Bloody Bill Anderson that carried 6 to 8 between his belt and his holster. But Hickok was a 2-gun man, used the twist draw. The other draw that you could effect was a cross draw, by reaching across your chest and grabbing the opposite, because again, the butt is facing forward. But Hickok, from the writings and recollections of Edwards and some of the others that were that were in Abilene at the time, they recall that it was a twist draw or a plains draw.
Ah, interesting. And here's something else that I've always wondered about. Like in shows like I feel slightly foolish to keep harping on these old Western tropes in TV and film. But in shows like Deadwood, there seems to be a shootout on every episode. How often did a lawman have to, like, a quick draw or actually draw his weapon in anger on somebody?
In the earlier frontier era, say 1867 through probably 73, the firearm was, a primary weapon, and it was used regularly. But the broader view is, the media for years has painted the cattle towns, the railheads, the frontier towns as being extremely violent, which was not the case. If you look at Abilene, Kansas in its heyday of 1871, when Wild Bill was the marshal, versus Kansas City at the same time, and you look at murders per, call it 100,000 used today, but if you look at the number of murders based on the population, any given Saturday night, Kansas City had more shootings in that same era than Abilene had during an entire season. Now, we sensationalized the Old West because it was a time of, frontier, manifest destiny, strong men, strong women, settling the frontier. But the truth of the matter is, if you take a look at a violent area at one point, 5 Points in New York, if you've ever seen, the movie, well, anyway, I won't go into that, but that was considered one of the most violent spots in the free world at that time. So, Abilene, Hayes, Ellsworth, uh, Wichita, Honeywell, I'm sorry, they didn't hold a candle to 5 Points in good old New York City or even Kansas City at the time. So yes, they were violent, but it was more sensationalized because it was one-on-one. It wasn't necessarily gang related like it was later in the frontier. But no, it was not the shoot 'em up, blood running in the streets as many would have you believe.
And it's sort of, from what you've said and what I've read, it sounds like a well-known or a competent lawman like Hickok could rely on his reputation and his just his personality to keep the peace in many cases. Would you say that that's accurate?
Absolutely. I think that dawned on Hickok after Hayes. Um, the reputation kind of shocked him and created some of the situations there in Hayes. And from that point forward, then you get the Hickok who, sat with his back to the wall, who always entered a room, and then, stood against the wall, who, when he did his rounds, instead of relying solely upon his 51 navies, carried a shotgun, or did his rounds on horseback with a double-barreled shotgun. Yeah, the reputation was something, especially we see it in Abilene and we see it in Deadwood. Probably Deadwood's the best example. While in Deadwood, there had been a reward set to kill Hickok by, I think it was Ben Thompson and Phil Coe's family. And again, he wasn't popular with Texans. And supposedly 8 toughs came into Deadwood. And at the Bell Union, I believe they said they were drinking and talking about how they were going to do Hickok in. Colorado Charlie made a beeline to their camp, which was just a little south of town on the creek down there, and told Wild Bill what was going on. He immediately got up, put on his guns, went straight up to the saloon, disarmed them all, and basically made them take off their boots as well and marched them out of town. So at that point in time, I mean, let's be honest, if they were good with a gun at all, and there's 8 of them, yes, they could have probably done him in. Now, how many would he have taken with him? We don't know. But his reputation was that 8 men who were hardened criminals and killers backed down and were allowed to be disarmed, take off their boots, and marched out of town. So, yeah, a reputation can be a powerful thing, especially on the frontier West.
That's amazing. And speaking of some of these towns in the frontier West, we have a question from JT. Did Wild Bill have any ties to Kansas City or to the Lawrence area?
Oh, absolutely. Kansas City and Lawrence both were home to him at different times. Kansas City, probably on a more regular basis. He had a close friendship with a Dr. Thorne. And remember, Kansas City was kind of the Paris on the plains at the time. What would happen basically is when the cattle season was over, the gamblers, the prostitutes, basically 80% of the population of these cattle towns would come into Kansas City. Hickok himself would then come to Kansas City and was known to live with Dr. Thorpe, Thorpe, yeah. And used to gamble at the Marble Hall, which was I think, if I remember correctly, 5th and Walnut. It's a parking lot now, but that was one of the big gambling houses. And he would spend the winter here and had a lot of friends in Topeka as well. He was known to visit the legislature. A lot of the people that he had known from Bleeding Kansas, the border wars and the Civil War, would occasionally be in Cheyenne. Springfield as well. He lived in Springfield, especially Kansas City and Springfield after he left the Cody combination in 1873, if I remember correctly, to 74. He spent a lot of time here.
That's very interesting. So, all right. So here's a great question from Jane. Did Wild Bill have a wife and children during the time he was active as a spy and or lawman? If so, where did they live?
Hickok married late in life to Agnes Thatcher Lake. She was a circus owner that he had met in Abilene, and she, what was it? I think Edwards wrote that she fell in love with him right down into the basement. And they corresponded for a number of years, then married in '76 in Cincinnati, and then he went west. Uh, he did not want to be a kept man, so to speak, and work the circus with her. He wanted to go to Deadwood and find gold, I suppose, establish himself there. Uh, there were a number of women that Hickok was popular with. Probably the most of note that we can trace was during his time in Hayes with a woman who was known as Indian Annie, and even so much so that when she passed away, she was, I think her grave says Mrs. Hickok. Uh, there were always stories that he had had a son with her. Uh, Unfortunately, the son was born at a period that was after he was already murdered in Deadwood. Um, so no children, uh, married to Agnes Thatcher Lake, and she did have a daughter that Hickok did refer to fondly, and she and his daughter ended up even performing with Cody on horseback. She was quite the equestrian.
That's interesting. So here's another good question about Hickok's personal life. So Rosa, Joseph Rosa, who you mentioned, the great Western historian, writes that there were rumors that Hickok had started to develop health issues in his 30s. Has this been verified?
The only health issue that's been referred to at that time, and let's just back up for a second there. And Joseph G. Rosa and I were friends for about 20 years. In fact, I ended up, uh, when Greg Herman could no longer travel with him, I ended up being kind of a gopher for him because, again, he resided in England. And he was an absolute first class researcher. You can ask most of the people at the Kansas State Historical Society. He could read old microfiche and original documents for hours and hours. So when he sent me on those missions, I had to develop the ability to do the same. Uh, there's always been questions about Hickok's eyesight, that later in years that he had problems with, who knows, cataracts or whatever. Um, the research that Joe did, and he's done quite a bit of it on it, was there was a condition called trachoma, which from being out in the plains or areas, this was something that a lot of the British troops had developed during their times in Africa, that you would get a reddening of the eyes. And there was also, I think that manifested itself when he was on stage with Cody, because they used the very strong calcium lights. And he saw that Cody was getting a lot of the spotlight, and he requested of the operator to shine that light on him. Well, on a performance, well, they did shine the light on him, and it hurt his eyes so badly that he actually had a loaded pistol with him, and he shot the light out. So he had some issue with his eyes. From everything that the research indicates, it was this reddening of the eyes from being in the sun quite a bit. But I mean, there are no medical records to where he had examinations and he had a definite diagnosis of anything.
Okay. Well, this seems like a good time to bring up the end of the Hickok of fact as opposed to the Hickok of legend. So how did Wild Bill Hickok ultimately meet his demise? And well, let's start with that question first. Like, how did he, what was his death? How did that happen?
It's almost something out of a Greek tragedy. Again, he was the first and the preeminent pistolier. He was considered the gunfighter. So, you know, he had to die with his boots on, which is exactly what happened. When he was in Deadwood in 1876, again, Deadwood was not even part of the United States at that time. It was an outlaw town. It was a mining town. Many of the miners had started looking to Hickok for kind of keeping a lid on some of the things, which he did. But I don't know that he had any aspirations to be law enforcement there. He felt his law enforcement days were behind him, especially after the tragedy of killing a close friend in Abilene, Mike Williams. There was a criminal element that obviously wanted the town to be wide open because they were making huge amounts of money from all the illicit activities, whether it was gambling or robbing people on the trail or prostitution or that sort of thing. So they would not welcome any kind of law enforcement. As the story goes, Hickok had been having, I guess, visions or dreams of him not leaving that area, of his own death. And of course, they chided him about that. And then August 2nd, he awoke and, I mean, life was renewed. He wasn't having these dreams anymore. He, took his morning bath, which everyone thought was a little funny, but he did bathe daily, which was not the routine on the frontier. And then that evening went back to play cards. A young man that he'd been playing with the night before, last name he was using Sutherland at the time, but that was not his name, had lost to him, was short in the gold dust that he had, and Hickok admonished him, you shouldn't gamble money that you don't have. Well, Bill Sutherland, aka Jack McCall, went back to his tent, got the difference, and Hickok looked at him and said, "Did that break you?" He said, "Yes." Well, Hickok then gave him a silver dollar, so goes, "I'm not going to keep you from eating." And so the next day when Hickok was in there playing, evidently that had struck McCall wrong. And Hickok was always very cautious. He sat with his back to the wall. And remember, a lot of the saloons at that time were only half walls with canvas roofs. They sat on stools and had small tables. He had come in on August 2nd, and his normal spot was taken by Charlie Rich. And Rich was having a run of luck. And when Hickok asked for his spot again, he didn't want to give it up, obviously, because he was being lucky in that spot. And they all gave him a hard time saying, "Oh, gosh, no one's going to shoot you, Bill." So he sat with his back to the bar to where he could see each door. So he was aware of his surroundings. Again, during gameplay, he asked Rich again that he would like to have his seat by the wall. And again, Rich was still having a fair amount of luck. He said, "No, I'd like to keep it." And so Bill acquiesced. Jack McCall had been a swamper in a lot of the saloons. And a swamper is a person who cleans up the sawdust, empties the spittoons. He was not someone that you would note and it would immediately set up a red flag saying, "This is a dangerous person." So Bill was playing, and there was a gentleman by the name of Captain Massey that was sitting directly across from him. And Massey had a terrible habit of looking at what they call deadwood, which were the discarded cards, which is, verboten. It's against the rules. So Bill was giving him a hard time about looking at the deadwood when McCall stepped behind him, pulled a Navy revolver, as everyone described it, said, "Take that, damn you," and then shot Wild Bill in the back of the head, the ball exiting just below his eye on the right cheek. Massey, who was sitting across from Wild Bill, the ball lodged in his wrist. He instantly assumed that Wild Bill had shot him because he was continuing to look at the deadwood. So it started a panic. People fled the saloon. Hickok, I guess, was motionless for just a moment and then toppled off his stool. And finally, they went back in to look and realized that no, Hickok was not on a tear and people didn't have to hide under their beds in Deadwood, that in fact he had been shot. McCall had run out of the saloon after snapping the revolver at the bartender and a couple others in the saloon, and the gun would not go off. There was one chamber in that revolver that would fire, and that was the one that had killed Wild Bill. He jumped on a horse. The cinch was loose. The saddle toppled him to the ground. He scrambled down the street as he was being chased now and hid in a butcher shop where they pulled him out of the butcher shop and then convened a miners' court, which was again, an illegal trial because it was in an illegal town, which was in a not part of the United States. That's another story. But so then when I say that his death was almost the fulfillment of a Greek tragedy, yeah, you know, the preeminent gunfighter of the time is murdered by a nobody, and the only chamber that would go off in the revolver is the one that killed Wild Bill. And that was really about the only way that a legend like that could die.
Right, right. Well, Stuart, we're nearing the end of our time today. I have one final question for you. In your opinion, why does Wild Bill Hickok remain such a famous figure?
Several reasons. He embodies the frontier West. He was a scout. He was, you know, a scout for both the Union and during the Plains Indian Wars. He was, I won't say hobnob, but he worked with people of equal fame. Custer thought a lot of him. He was a scout for Custer. It was a very exciting time in American history. It was that manifest destiny, go west, young man. But anyway, grow the nation. And he embodied all those things that people also saw in Kit Carson. Larger than life, you know, the white knight of the plains, so to speak, which we know that's not the case, but he was still an individual that had a highly defined sense of right and wrong, was always one to step up and defend the weaker, and was, by the people that knew him and friends, he was soft-spoken, he was self-deprecating, he was a practical joker, and that's kind of what got him in trouble with the Reputation because of the fun they were having with the gentleman who wrote the article for Harper's Weekly between him and Richard Bentley Owen, who was Captain Honesty. So, I mean, few people know that he had a little terrier dog that he was very fond of. And when he was in Hayes, when he was getting ready to go out on a scout for the military, or he was going out on a job with as a deputy marshal, he would gamble and lose the dog. Then when he got back to town, he would gamble and win his dog back. You know, people don't realize he also played the fiddle. So he was a real person who, when was needed and called upon to do the right thing and step up, he did. So I think that's part of it, is the romance of the West, and the fact that, you know, he was a two-gun town taming marshal that at the same time was a real person. He wasn't this steely-eyed purveyor of death.
Well, Stuart, you've really given us a much more faceted, rounded out picture of this famous man, and I really appreciate it. So thank you for bringing us the reality behind some of these myths today.
Well, my pleasure.
Well, and thanks to everyone who joined us and watched and participated in the live online event. So with that, I would just like to say thanks again and goodbye, everyone, and we'll see you next time.